epithelial lining is separated from the lamina propria. So again, those three sections. What's in the middle? What's between those particular layers? Okay. So find the answer to that one. If you think about mucus production in the nasal cavity, where do those come from? What structures in the nasal cavity particularly are responsible for mucus production? And in the tracheobronchial tree, it's the Clara cells and the submucosal glands. That's where mucus comes from in the tracheobronchial tree. What about up here in the nasal cavity? Find the answer to that. The cells that line the tracheobronchial tree, what were they? Do you remember? Pseudostratified.
Columnar epithelial cells.
Ciliated. Columnar. Pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. The whole tracheobronchial tree is lined with those cells. What's the function of those cells? To move the mucus up. Yeah, we called it, the text called it the mucociliary escalator, or the mucus blanket. And there was a gel layer and there was a sol layer. And the ciliated cells in these pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium propel the mucus 2 centimeters upwards by beating up to 1,500 times per minute. So I think that was an important piece to the types of cells that line the tracheobronchial tree. What's interesting about that is that what happens to the cilia in the 20th and 21st and 23rd and 28th generation as they continue to bifurcate?
They transform into different cell shape.
They do. They change to more cuboidal in shape. But doesn't that diminish the ability to move or wash foreign material out? And so there are certain pathologies that result because of the changing of those cells from pseudostratified cells to more cuboidal cells. And in certain kinds of pathology like silicosis, asbestosis, the particles get down into those lower generations, and then there's no cilia to help to move them up, and that's where silicosis and asbestosis start to fester and get to be a problem, is because specifically of the anatomy. So the anatomy is extraordinarily important in understanding how these cells change, and where the cells change, disease can sometimes be the result of not having the cells to move this stuff up the mucociliary escalator. I think it's a fascinating study. So some of the diseases that Kelly will talk about will be because of the anatomy. They settle in particular areas of your lungs because of the anatomy. What's an occupational exposure, by the way? If you're exposed to a pathogen occupationally, do you know what that's called, Katrina?
Shoot, it was yesterday. There was one that said sick something. What was that? Sick disease or something like that? So
environmental or environmental lung diseases are called pneumoconiosis. Pneumoconiosis. So it's specifically caused by agents of the environment. So if you hear that term pneumoconiosis, it's an occupational exposure. So asbestos is an occupational exposure, and it would be a pneumoconiosis. But it's because of the anatomy. What structure is the epiglottis located in?
Trachea.
Yeah, the trachea is specifically down below.
The larynx.
The laryngopharynx is really the glottis, the epiglottis, and actually the thymus is around the outside, but it's all within the larynx. That's right. Neurotransmitter for this parasympathetic nervous system. So sometimes we give parasympatholytics to stimulate the parasympathetic nervous system. Sometimes we give sympathomimetic drugs to stimulate the sympathetic nervous system. What's the neurotransmitter for the sympathetic nervous system?
Acetylcholine knows for parasympathetic, is that?
Yeah, acetylcholine is parasympathetic. The epinephrine is the sympathetic nervous system. So be sure what the neurotransmitter is for each, the parasympathetic and the sympathomimetic nervous system. Major muscle of ventilation. So I don't ask for I don't ask for small, obscure muscles, I ask for the biggest muscles. The biggest, what's the biggest cartilage in the larynx? Biggest cartilage in the larynx, what is it?
Thyroid.
Yeah.
Yes, very good.
Duh.
The thyroid cartilage.
The thyroid.
So I usually ask for the biggest things, the largest thing, the most important thing.
Sorry, for what? So this is just the
In
muscles?
this case, it's the largest, it's the major muscle of ventilation. And actually, the diaphragm is two specific muscles. It's the right hemidiaphragm and left hemidiaphragm. It's really not one by itself. But there are two sides, and the phrenic nerve comes down and stimulates the diaphragm on both sides to contract down the spine. Let's see. Membrane which lines the inside of the thoracic diaphragm. So you've got the thoracic cage on the outside, and then the inside of the lungs themselves. There's a membrane. And be certain you know which one is the outside membrane around the thoracic cage and what the inside membrane is. What is it, Jim?
Visceral.
You're looking at me kind of.
He just does that all.
Visceral.
He does that a lot. I should get used to it. So what's the outside membrane?
Parietal.
Parietal pleura, that's right. So the inside is the visceral pleura, and that between those two spaces is the pleural space, and it's a potential space of -2 centimeters. So when the diaphragm contracts and moves down, it increases the negative pressure between the visceral and the parietal pleura, right? Well, there shouldn't be any question about that one. Structures with the greatest cross-sectional area. This was a diagram in Desjardins. And if you think about the trachea by itself, that's the zero generation, right? That's the zero generation. But the trachea is about 6 centimeters long, and it's about 12 centimeters long, and maybe 3 centimeters across, maybe 4 centimeters across. So it has a cross-sectional area of, the radius would be 3 and the length would be 12. So it's about 36 square centimeters, right, or square meters. So by itself, how many trachea are there in the tracheobronchial tree? There's one. How many main stem bronchi do you have? Two. And then it starts to segment into the 3rd generation and the 4th generation and the 6th and the 8th and the 12th and the 18th. They get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, but what can you say about cross-section? Which one has the largest cross-section area? The airways at the terminal bronchioles or the one trachea?
Terminal?
Why would you say that?
Because it's not one little thing, it's a million.
Yes,
of them.
indeed. So because they branch out exponentially, you have more and more surface area because you've got more of the smaller airways and you've only got one trachea. So if I give you the main stem bronchus, the trachea, the subsegmental bronchi, the brachial bronchi, or the respiratory bronchioles, which one of those structures do you think would have the largest cross-sectional area?
Respiratory bronchial.
Why would you say that, Coffee?
Just because it's as you said, at the end of the respiratory, pretty much the respiratory bronchioles are pretty much the ending before it reaches the alveoli sacs. So from there, you're just going to occupy.
Okay, so does everybody see the rationale behind that?
Mhm.
We're talking about the smallest structures, but there's infinitely more of them, which gives them a larger cross-sectional area. That's what, remember we talked about Fick's law last week, didn't we, or was that 2 weeks ago? That might
That
be
was last week.
Was it last week? So we talked about Fick's law. The rate of gas exchange is dependent upon surface area. That's right. And so we're thinking about 300 million single-cell sacs that are delivering oxygen, diffusing oxygen across the alveolar capillary membrane. So there are 300 million alveoli. It provides a huge cross-sectional area. When we lose alveoli, like in emphysema, in the pathology emphysema, you destroy those interalveolar septa. So the cross-sectional area is less and you don't exchange as much gas. So this idea of cross-section, bless you, cross-section is a really important piece in gaseous diffusion, in molecular surface area, and making sure that there's enough area to diffuse what we need, which is oxygen across the alveolar capillary membrane. Make sense? So I use that question to help us to really define what we mean by surface area. And in Fick's law, surface area is extraordinarily important to explain gaseous diffusion. Okay? Just means we have more of it to diffuse. Next question. In the text, we talked about the accessory muscles of inspiration and the accessory muscles of expiration, right? And those are muscles we use in addition to the chest and rib cage wanting to move up and out. And we usually don't use those muscles unless there's disease. So we inhale, we use accessory muscles of inhalation when our chest is already hyperinflated, and we try to expand and open up our shoulders, really. Our sternocleidomastoids, our trapezius muscles move up and down this way. And so be sure I don't care about if you know where we insert or where we originate from in these muscles. All I want you to know is, as a group, what are the muscles of inspiration, what are the muscles of expiration. Okay, so pay attention to those. Look back in chapter 2 and find out what transthoracic pressure is. So just a simple definition of transthoracic pressure. Remember, we had the 3 pressures: transthoracic, transpulmonary, and transairway pressure. So find out what transthoracic pressure is specifically. In the alveoli, they're kept open by the chest and rib cage wanting to expand, right? I mean, the rib cage itself wants to fly out. What do the lungs want to do? What do the alveoli want to do? Collapse. They want to collapse. So somewhere in between, of the chest wanting to expand and the alveoli wanting to collapse, there's a critical opening pressure that keeps alveoli open. So the question says, as distending pressure falls below critical closing pressure, what happens? So if you've got a closing pressure, I suspect that the opening pressure is pretty darn close to the closing pressure. So if the pressure falls below closing pressure, what would the alveoli want to do? Collapse. Okay. So it's all in the way the question is answered. If we're talking about closing pressure, the alveoli want to collapse. If the alveoli open, it's because they've extended the pressure beyond critical opening pressure. Let's see. Oh, this one talks about Pucell's law. The pressure in the airway, pressure equals the radius to the 4th. So divided by NLV. So the main thing in Pucell's law is this thing right here, that when you reduce the radius by half, so you're going to decrease the radius by 1/2, what happens to this, the pressure? If you have an airway, you reduce the radius by, so you're going to make it smaller, what happens to the pressure through that?
Times it by 16.
You increase the pressure by 16 times. So I want you to just remember the relationship of the law. That's Pucell's. Puceau's. I think the double L's in French is an O. Puceau's. I say Pucell. So if you reduce the radius by half, you increase the resistance by 16 times, and you decrease the flow rate by 16 times. That's the take-home message of what that law says. Alrighty. Hi.
Oh.
We're just barely getting started here. Just going over some questions in the questions for the exam. I'll open it to all of the remote sites, so you can.
This is the take-home message. All like reduce the radius by half. You increase the what?
A couple students from there, I think a lot of them just went over to UVU and used the testing center. If that's helpful at all.
By 16 times, and then what was the other part?
Okay, we talked about movement of gas through a tube. So if we move air into the trachea, right and left main stem bronchus, once it goes down into the trachea, how is that air described in terms of fairly fairly even gas flow through the trachea. Do you remember the term that we used? Is it random or is it streamlined? And that's called,
Oh, I know what you're talking about. It's the
Um,
flow, right?
it's a flow rate.
Laminar?
Laminar flow.
There we
Very good,
go.
Jimmy. Laminar flow. So when it gets into the trachea, it flows rather streamlined. When it hits the bifurcations, it becomes more turbulent. And somewhere in between of laminar and turbulent is this idea of transitional flow. That was in one of our study guides. So pay attention to when gas hits these bifurcations and becomes more turbulent. The relationship is that when gas flow is turbulent, that it creates more resistance. Okay? And in later parts of the curriculum, next semester, we're going to be putting tubes into people's airways and forcing gas through their tracheobronchial tree. And so we have to consider what the pressure is as we make that gas more laminar and streamlined versus when it hits those bifurcations and becomes more, there's more resistance. And we can tell, Armando, because the pressure goes up when we use more turbulent gas flow. So we want to try to use fairly slow, steady flow rates rather than fast, turbulent flow rates. In the West, we'll talk about it later, but in the West, we tend to use faster flow rates on our ventilators. In the East, they tend to use slower, more laminar flow rates on the order of 20 liters per minute. Here in the West, almost every ventilator in the West is set on double that kind of flow.
Why is that?
It's regional differences. I wish I could say that there was a particular reason for it. And the bottom line is that we use flow rates that help to create a natural IE ratio. So if we breathe really fast, we have a longer E time, you see? As opposed to a slow inspiratory rate, our E time is less. So our expiratory time is lower. So it's trying to create a natural I to E ratio with flow rates of how the air goes in, how we're forcing it in through this endotracheal tube with either laminar or turbulent gas flow, depending on, you know, what's usual in the area you're working at. I've had therapists that go to Ohio and Florida and North Carolina, and they email me back and they say that they get into these regional differences of how they set up their initial parameters on mechanical ventilators, and it's different when they learn. So it's not the same everywhere across the country, and different physicians will learn different ways depending on who their attending was. So I'm trying to teach a way to set up, to think about and be cognizant about resistance in the airway based upon fast or slow flow rates. I don't think there's a right or a wrong there. It's just it's what we do and how we recommend it in the end, and hopefully the patient does it. Okay, number 14, the portion of gas which is not physiologically important in ventilation. Do you remember what we called that?
Sorry, say it again?
The portion of gas that's not physiologically important in gas exchange. So in other words, air that we breathe in that doesn't get to the alveoli to exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide. Do you remember what we called that?
Dead space?
Dead space, that's right. So there is some dead, and there's two different kinds of dead space, right? There's alveolar dead space, and which is no flow in the blood vessel, and there's physiologic dead space. So the addition of physiologic and anatomic equals alveolar dead space.
What was the second word? Physiological?
Physiologic dead space. And so physiologic is equal to about a cc per pound. We assumed it to be about 150 cc's. So that's gas that doesn't participate in gas exchange. It's caught in the airways. It doesn't make it to the alveoli. Okay. If we were to describe if we were to describe breathlessness, breathlessness is a conscious awareness of your breathing. And there are patients that recognize it's kind of hard to breathe. So what's a term that would define breathlessness or a conscious awareness of your breathing? It was in the last part of chapter 2, I think, when we described the breathing patterns. So look up a conscious awareness of your breathing. What would that be, Jimmy?
I know what it is. I can't say it out. I don't
Okay.
remember it. It starts with a D.
Yes, it does.
This.
That's exactly it. Did everybody make a note of that?
I couldn't say it right, dude.
Did everybody make a note of that?
Jimmy's
killing it.
A conscious awareness of the difficulty of breathing, and it's called dyspnea. Yeah.
It seems
So,
too easy
How
to
do
be
you,
just.
how do you
Yeah,
spell
don't.
that?
So one thing about my tests can be a little challenging, but don't overthink them. Don't overthink the questions. I'm not thinking too deeply. The bottom line is I want you to have this information. I want you to be successful. I don't want us, a reasonable amount of study will get us through. And then even with 70s and 80s on the exams, you're still on the path for A's. So it's not about passing and failing. You've done quizzes and study guides and terminology questions. I add those to the exams and then average the exam and the homework to equal whatever our test grade is. Okay, so it's a combination of everything, and just like in the curriculum when I try to answer your questions the first year and then you answer your questions the second year, we're trying to get to a place where you can use this is all usable information. We're structuring it in a way that you can use it. So having you come up with the term dyspnea is because we use it all the time. We use it to describe particular characteristics, and it's not a foreign word in the hospital in the context that we see it. Oh, that patient's dyspnea, and it's a common characteristic. So I'm not trying to overthink things. I'm not trying to give you the tiniest, most insignificant piece of information and giving you a test question on it. It's because we use these terms and these words and we understand it in the background. Okay. Volume of air which moves into and out of the lungs in one quiet breath.
Tidal volume.
Yeah, exactly. It's just one quiet breath, which is defined as tidal volume. The average flow rate in the middle 50%. That's a very particular way to describe this flow rate. So find out in chapter 3, was it? What the middle 50% is.
The middle 50%?
The middle 50%. We talked about it.
You have the 4, 6,
Yeah. Is it the ratio?
Number 19, inspiratory reserve volume. So in this case, I give you a piece of that, right? We know this is tidal volume. This is inspiratory reserve. This is expiratory reserve. What's down below it?
Residual volume.
So I ask you, inspiratory reserve. So how would you come up with that piece? You could take vital capacity minus VT minus ERV. That would give you IRV. So you've got to be able to come up with volumes and capacities that equal certain volumes, and we have to be able to think about them in that way. I can guarantee you'll see a question like that on your, maybe 2 or 3 on the national board exam. They want you to know these volumes and this capacity. So if I wanted you to find FRC, FRC is equal to what?
ERV and RV.
Yeah, ERV plus residual, and we should just know that. We need to know the volumes and the capacities. Okay. So there's only one question like this on mine, but I guarantee you'll see one on the national board exam that'll have you make sense in some way, the capacities and volumes. It's ironic because when I was in undergraduate school, in doing basic physiology, we went through the lungs, and this thing I didn't pay much attention to until after I became a respiratory therapist, and then it was really, really important. But when I was in undergraduate work, I didn't understand how important that would be in the future. But anyway, it's real important now. Let's see. So when we exhale and we get a forced maneuver, the text, if you remember, broke it up into the first 30% and the last 70%. First 30% was said to be dependent upon how much effort the patient put into it. And so the resulting volume was dependent on effort. The last 70%, the more effort you put into it, it resulted in a decreased flow rate. The more muscular effort you put into it. That was called effort independent. So look at the difference between effort dependence and effort independence, and where that is in a forced maneuver. Lateral pressure on an airway from muscular force during forced expiration. So when we force the air out of our lungs and we're trying to get as much volume out, something happens to the inside of your lungs. This is in that same chapter. Something happens where there's a point in which the pressure inside the lungs and the pressure outside the lungs is the same. And what happens to the lungs is they compress. So there's an equilibrium. So find out what happens when those pressures are the same. Make sure you pay attention to what's happening when those pressures are the same. Static forces. We call the static forces in the lungs cause the lungs to collapse. The static forces in the rib cage cause the rib cage and thoracic cage to expand. So somewhere in between there, when there's no movement, no gas flow, the lungs are somewhat open. Okay? So the static force, what static means is there's no gas flow. There's no inhalation, there's no exhalation. It's just somewhere in the middle without gas flow. So static forces cause the lungs to recoil inward. Next question. The ability of the lung to accept a new volume. What's it? When we inhale air and we get a new volume into our lungs, what's that called? Exactly. So what we're trying to do is that when we inhale, we change the volume in our lungs. What we're doing is we're measuring how readily the lungs will accept that volume of gas. That's measured as the change in volume divided by the change in pressure, and that's called compliance. Compliance is the ability to understand the work of breathing. And there'll come a time next semester when we're doing lung compliance measurements on patients in the ICU with a ventilator every 2 hours. And you'll get this number, and you have to make sense of this number. The number you're getting is called a compliance, and that compliance is an indicator of how easy or hard it is to breathe, the work of breathing. So compliance is an extraordinarily important concept to us. Okay, the respiratory zone, largest cartilage in the larynx. What's that one?
Thyroid.
Thyroid cartilage. So, I'll comment on that later. The law which states that if volume remains constant, pressure and temperature vary directly. So make sure you know the difference between Boyle's law, Charles' law, and Gay-Lussac's law, what the variables are. If you know what the variables are, you'll be able to answer the question of which law it is.
Boyle, Charles, and what?
Gay-Lussac. Those are just basic gas laws. The one that we use the most is Boyle's. Volume pressure relationship. Here's a good one with the diffusion of gases. When altitude increases, what happens to the barometric pressure?
Decreases.
Yeah, so you should have a firm idea of what happens to the barometric pressure when we go up in altitude. What about the FiO2? What happens to the FiO2 when you go up in elevation? Yes, that's a tricky question. but not for you guys, because you understand that the FiO2 doesn't change on the surface of the Earth and at the top of Everest. The FiO2 that we breathe is 21%. So we don't change the FiO2, we change the altitude, and that changes the pressure, and the pressure influences gaseous exchange. Next question, when altitude increases, the concentration of atmospheric gases does what? Like oxygen, what happens to oxygen as altitude increases? It stays the same. So there's two questions. It's not that tricky for us. It
So
shouldn't.
the concentration stays the same.
Concentration stays the same. It's at sea level, it's 21%. At the top of Everest, we're still breathing 21%. The difference is that we're breathing it under lower pressure. Yeah.
So it's harder to get
So
it.
So you don't have as much pressure to force it through the alveolar capillary membrane. So as a result, we did that with the alveolar gas equation, didn't we?
Yeah.
The top of Everest, you have a barometric pressure of,
Pushing your oxygen.
you have a barometric pressure of 330. What do you subtract from the barometric pressure?
The water.
Water vapor
Water
pressure.
vapor.
So barometric pressure minus water vapor pressure times the FiO2 minus the PaCO2 times 1.25. 330 minus 47 is 283 times 0.21 minus 50. What's 283 times 0.21?
Sorry, what is it?
Anybody got that? 283 times 0.21.
59.
59 minus 50, so your PaO2 is 9. All right, we can survive on a PO2 of 9, right?
How did you get the 50 again? We times it by 1.25, but what do we times?
This is 40.
40.
If we're breathing normally, that's 40.
40, okay.
40 times 1.25 is 50.
Okay, that's what I was.
So you subtract your CO2 environment. In your alveoli, you've got O2 and you've got CO2. So they have to equal what's in the alveoli. So O2 is 9, CO2 is 50. You've got a partial pressure of 59 with both of them. So PO2 at the top of Everest is 9. That's why they wear oxygen, is because they don't have enough pressure to force it through the alveolar capillary membrane. And then there are a few that try to climb it without oxygen. They acclimatize. Their hemoglobins are 20 or 22 grams. So they carry more oxygen.
Does that increase perfusion then, when you build up hemoglobin? Or
Not perfusion. Perfusion stays the same, and it goes to what vessels are open. We'll talk a little bit more about that in the next chapter. So that's where that comes from. So the FiO2 doesn't change. The concentration of gases doesn't change. What changes is the altitude, and that reduces the pressure.
So it's basically just the opposite.
In the end of last chapter, we talked about the difference between nitrous oxide and carbon monoxide, right? We said that nitrous oxide was perfusion limited. The only way to get more nitrous was to get the heart to beat faster, to move more blood.
So run around the block.
Run around the block before you go to the dentist.
Yeah,
In good
And
shape.
get more nitrous in. But it's a perfusion limited gas. What was the diffusion limited gas?
CO.
Carbon monoxide. It's a function of the integrity of the alveolar capillary membrane. The thickness of the tissue influences how much carbon monoxide gets across the membrane, because it never reaches its partial pressure. If you've got a partial pressure of 10 in your alveoli, it only, maybe a tenth of that gets across the alveolar capillary membrane, because the transit time doesn't allow it to reach equilibrium. You never get all of your CO across the alveolar capillary membrane. So we use those two things as an example of perfusion limited and diffusion limited gases.
Did you say carbon monoxide?
Monoxide. So it's
diffusion.
CO. Yeah, carbon monoxide.
And CO2 is
CO2 doesn't, it's not illustrated that way.
For nothing.
Yeah. Diffusion, so this particular question, I'm inadvertently asking you about Fick's law. So the diffusion of gas is proportional to the partial pressure, proportional to the diffusion, the area, and inversely proportional to the thickness of the tissue.
Well, what? They say that one more time.
Well, so Fick's law said.
No, but I know those three factors. I just, the way you said it was
Fick's
weird.
law said that the diffusion of any gas is relative to the surface area times P1 minus P2 and divided by the thickness. So the way that we understand that is that diffusion of gases is directly proportional to the surface area,
Pressure.
directly proportional to the partial pressure difference, and inversely proportional to the thickness. Inversely proportional. So the thicker the tissue, the less the diffusion. So that's how we understand that law. Not as the law itself, but in the relationship of surface area, partial pressure, and thickness. Okay. So if compliance is change in volume divided by change in pressure, what's its reciprocal?
Change in pressure.
Yeah, and then what's that called? Change in pressure divided by change in volume. So if this is compliance, what's that? Find out.
I'm just kidding.
It's right around the compliance chapter.
Non-compliance?
Yeah, how is something non-compliant? What do we call that? Find the answer to that one. Okay, find the answer.
That's this.
Very good, Alicia.
Tell me we find it.
Sites of gas exchange which originate from the bronchioles. Remember that inside of the lungs, that the visceral pleura surrounds each lobe in the lungs, but that primary lobe is also called an acinus. I don't know if you picked that up from the reading. So there are some diseases, I don't know if Kelly's gone over these for you, but there's a disease of emphysema called pan-acinar and centra-acinar. So pan-acinar means it's the whole lobe. Centra-acinar means it's the central airways of that lobe. So just recognize that I'm using a term that is synonymous with the lobe of the lung. It's called an acinus. Okay. I just didn't want you to miss that one. So acinar and lobular are the same thing. Function of the primary airways. So what do the primary airways do? I've given you a list. You pick which ones the airways do. Right? Gas exchange takes place in which structures of the lungs? I don't give you the alveoli. Those are the smallest structures, but it's within the lobe of the lung again. Okay? So look at the structure that means the lobe of the lung. Lymphatic tissues within the pulmonary structures, what's their function? So look to see, I think it's in chapter 1, they give you a pretty strong outline about the lymphatics and what they do in the system. Sympathetic stimulation of the airway. So we give sympathomimetic drugs. What's the result of giving a sympathomimetic?
Sympatho what?
A sympathomimetic, so it mimics the sympathetic nervous system. So when we give parasympatholytics, then we're mimicking the parasympathetic nervous system. So we use acetylcholine to try to, once the airway's open, we try not to make it snap back shut. When patients are wheezing and they're having a hard time breathing, we give them a sympathomimetic, and it helps to stimulate the sympathetic nervous system and relaxes smooth muscle. So the effect is that it creates the airway to open up, okay, when you give a sympathomagnetic. Okay. Transpulmonary pressure, make sure you know that, again, those three pressures that we put up on the board 2 weeks ago. Have a clear understanding of transpulmonary, transairway, and transthoracic pressure. Natural recoil of the lung. Some of these questions are structured as multiples. Have you heard of that term before? Occasionally, you'll have, so like in this one, you'll have A, B, C, D, and A will be 1 and 2, B will be 2 and 4, C will be 3 only, and D will be 3 and 4. So a multiple means there's usually more than one answer. The reason that we use multiples is the national board exam uses multiples. So I throw some in so you get used to the idea of multiples on the national board exam.
So on the Lindsey Jones
Yeah.
audio disc, it says that the NRBC is going away from
They're
multiple.
transitioning away from them, yeah. So that's nice, but I'm trying to still prepare you just in case you happen to see one, that it doesn't throw you for a loop and you're unsure what it's asking you or what the format is.
Okay.
So I just do it so that we're ready to go. There are sometimes I can structure a question that I can get more than one answer, and so I structure it as a multiple, just so you're familiar with that. But they're transitioning away. Sooner the better, I think. But I just don't want you to be unaware altogether when you sit for and pass your registry exam next December. Okay. Being able to breathe only in an upright position, what's that called? Find out what the name of that is.
What is it?
Oh.
Being able to breathe only in an upright position, what's that called? Find out. The volume of air that can be maximally exhaled after a maximal inhalation. What's that volume?
Capacity.
Number 43. Alveolar ventilation may decrease under these conditions. So remember, when we think about ventilation is simply the air that's going in and out. And if we take the respiratory rate times the tidal volume, we get minute ventilation. And so when we increase minute ventilation, that's called hyperventilation. When we decrease minute ventilation, that's hypoventilation, right? And then it has a direct effect on carbon dioxide. So ventilation and carbon dioxide go hand in hand. When we hypoventilate, CO2 goes up. When we hyperventilate, CO2 goes down. So what I'm trying to do is get us in a way to recognize what happens when alveolar ventilation decreases. So we expect that to have a direct effect on carbon dioxide, right? What would happen to carbon dioxide, Jamie?
Sorry, what was the question?
As alveolar ventilation decreases, so we're not breathing as much,
Okay.
what happens to CO2?
It's an increase, right?
It does. It goes up. That's right. So we're trying to help you to get a relational understanding of what happens with alveolar hyper and hypoventilation. This will be really important in a couple of chapters in the CO2 transport. So we're trying to help you to understand what happens to CO2 when we hyper and hypoventilate. It has a direct effect on acidosis or alkalosis. Yeah, we'll make that connection. But I'm trying to get us in the habit, at least to understand what happens with alveolar ventilation as we have more and more alveolar ventilation. That's hyperventilation. CO2 goes down. So I'm trying to get us in the habit of thinking about it in that way. Open space between the vocal cords and between the vocal cords. What is that?
Glottis?
Yeah, sure. Is the glottis a thing you can point to?
No.
No, it's a space. The glottis is just a It's a position more than anything. It's not a thing like the uvula in the back of the throat. You can push on it, right? The point at which the lumen of the airway is the same as the pressure surrounding the airway. What's that called? That gets back to the same idea when the pressure is inside the lung is the same as what's pushing on the lung. There's a point in which it's an equilibrium. What's that point called? Yeah, it is. Which of the following may be perfusion limited? We made a pretty big point to understand that oxygen can be both perfusion limited and diffusion limited. Under normal conditions, oxygen is perfusion limited. Under abnormal conditions, oxygen can be diffusion limited because it doesn't reach equilibrium in the transit time it has across the alveoli. So pay attention again to this idea of perfusion and diffusion limited and recognize that in disease states, oxygen can be diffusion and normally is perfusion. Diffusion across the alveolar capillary membrane in a patient with pneumonia. What can we expect? So I'm trying to come back to Fick's law and trying to help us to make the connection that if the surface area goes down, the partial pressure goes down, or the thickness goes up, diffusion is limited. And so that's in certain diseases. In certain diseases like fibrosis or pneumonia, that's really influencing Fick's law. And Fick's law suggests that diffusion is diminished. Okay? Let's see. 5 factors which influence diffusion.
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Yeah, of the 5 factors which influence diffusion, which would be the easiest for a respiratory care practitioner to influence? Which one do we influence? What do you think, Alicia?
Two.
Yes.
Definitely.
Can you make someone breathe? If we punch Jimmy in the stomach, would he breathe faster?
Can we test it out?
I volunteer.
I'll do that.
Was
I'll
that
volunteer.
you, Bobby, that said that, or was that you?
Well, no, I'll let you do it.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, surface
He would
area,
volunteer
partial pressure,
himself, though.
thickness. But which one of those can we influence the easiest? Can we influence the thickness of the tissue?
No. Is it
Can we
pressure?
influence surface area?
Partial pressure.
Pressure?
Partial pressure, yeah. So how do we influence partial pressure? Yeah, that's something as simple as that. We give them oxygen, which in the alveolar gas equation changes that. We normally breathe 21% in this atmosphere. If we give them 2 liters, that's 24%. If we give them 4 liters, that's 36%. If we give them 6 liters, that's 44%. If we give them a mass, a non-rebreather mass, that's 60 to 80%. Maybe up to 100. Depends. Depends on what the flow is. Right? So the easiest thing for us to influence is the partial pressure, and we do it by adjusting the FiO2. So that's a pretty major way that we influence gaseous exchanges with the FiO2. We use PEEP, we use mechanical structures, we use pressure too. The average rate of the airflow between 200 and 1200 milliliters of the forced vital capacity measured flows at high volumes remains a good index of the integrity of which airways?
Large airways?
Yep, that's an easy one.
Go, Bobby.
The law which states that if pressure is constant, volume and temperature vary directly. Find that one.
What were the 3 factors?
Charles,
Charles.
Boyles, Gay-Lussac.
No, so it's temperature, pressure, and volume, is that what it was?
Yeah, let me go back and see. It is volume and temperature. Volume and temperature.
Is it Charles?
It is. Yeah, so don't overthink these. They're easy, they're readily recognizable. The idea, I don't want to make us experts on gas laws or Fick's law. It's trying to gather information to help us to make sense moving forward. You know, and things that we've studied, laminar gas flow, turbulent gas flow, transitional gas flow, it's all in an effort to use it later on when we put tubes into their airways and actually force air into their lungs and make them breathe, you know, on life support machines. It's the conceptual information now that we're laying a foundation to use later. All of it's not important. Chapter 1, as you well know, is overwritten. It's every structure and everything everywhere in the pulmonary system. And you can see there's only a few anatomical questions. For the most part, there might be 10. There might be 10 anatomy questions. Most of the rest of them are relationship questions on Pucell's law or Laplace's law. It helps us to get an underlying basic understanding of the pulmonary system and how we're going to use it in disease prognosis. How we're going to use it. Does that help you study a little bit for the exam? So hopefully it won't be a surprise. Then you'll know what to focus on. You know, chapter 1, there's a lot of information, but I think the majority of the test comes from chapters 2, 3, and 4.
Is that all of it?
That's the first one.
That's the first one?
That's the first one.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Not bad.
You can